Okay, today we're going to be going over Alberta COVID death data. This is pulled directly from the government websites on September 15th, 2021. Introduction: Alberta has just introduced a vaccine passport. For me, this is the last straw, and it's time to fight back against this authoritarian government. I plan on filing a charter notice against the Alberta government stating that these new rules are an infringement/violation of my charter rights. This is a very complicated process, but I'm working through my ideas to create the most comprehensive and complete case possible. Based on the data provided by the Alberta government, uh, universal government vaccine mandates seem completely unreasonable in a free and democratic society. In this presentation, I'm going to go over deaths by age demographics, ICU admissions by age demographics, ICU capacity, ICU bed usage, and this is all for Alberta, comorbidities related to deaths and ICU admissions, comorbidities breakdown, COVID events after the first and second vaccine administration, current COVID cases based on vaccine status, adverse vaccine reactions Canada-wide. This is because Alberta hasn't published their numbers for adverse vaccine reactions. Annual deaths total for Alberta, and comparing that over the last about 20 years. And leading annual causes of death in Alberta. So total deaths since the start. So this is basically COVID going back to March of 2020. So we have a total death of 2,495 as of September 15th. Pulled the data a few hours back, so it doesn't actually include the 15th. I believe it goes to the 14th. So basically, if we go from age 0 or age 1 to 19, there's been no deaths from people who have gotten COVID. From the age bracket of 20 to 29, there's been 11 deaths through this whole, basically a year and a half period. For my age cohort, from 30 to 39, 17 deaths. 40 to 49 is 52 deaths. Age 50 to 59 is 127 deaths. Age 60 to 69 is 322 deaths. Age 70 to 79 is 529 deaths. So this is where it starts to get higher. And then age 80 plus, 1,436 deaths. So basically, your chance of actually dying, what would I say? So I believe this is just first the percentage breakdown. So if we look at the total percentages deaths, it's like 60 years and older, 60 to 80 plus years old, accounts for 91.66% of the deaths, whereas age 0 to 59 accounts for 8.3% of the deaths. So it's just significantly, this is just scaled to people who are older. Then if we actually look at the chance of death, so we basically do the total cases for each age demographic, and then we do the total deaths. And so it's like if you basically get diagnosed with this disease, and it's like, what is your chances of actually surviving or versus actually dying? And so if from age 1 to 19, your chances of death are 0. From 20 to 29, it's 0.02%. From age 30 to 39, again, this is my demographic. So if I caught COVID, I'd have a 0.03% chance of death, which seems extremely low. Age 40 to 49, it's 0.12%. Age 50 to 59, 0.41%. Age 60 to 69, 1.79%. So now we're starting to get a bit higher. Age 70 to 79 is 6.72%. And then finally 80 plus, and this is 19.83%. So it's basically a death sentence for anybody over 80 years old. It's like playing Russian roulette. You have a 1 in 5 chance of dying. But for anybody that's below 60 years old, you're basically under a 1% chance of death, which to me seems like insignificant. So now we go over to the COVID deaths by day over the past period since it looks like it goes back to about April. And so we look at it, kind of little bit of death, little bit, have this massive spike from November to March. And then we go back to kind of a little bit, and we're having a little bit of a spike here again. But this is just nothing compared to the previous. And I do believe yesterday they reported 25 COVID deaths, so that would get it back up to a much higher number. But it just doesn't seem like the deaths are kind of justifying what's happening. And to me, this also seems like it's a winter time disease. And it's like really checking vitamin D levels seems like the biggest issue to me. It's like, what if they had higher vitamin D levels? Would that fix these problems? And I actually have like a medical grade UVB lamp in my house because I have gut-tape psoriasis, and it helps tremendously for me. And I think most Canadians and most Albertans are actually quite low on vitamin D. So total ICU visits in Alberta. So we look at, basically there's been a total of 2,200 ICU visits for the whole period. Kind of go through it. So basically the group from 0 to 59, they've accounted for 28.64% of the ICU visits. And the group from, is that correct? These numbers, these percentages look a little off for my group percentages. I think I might have drawn the line wrong. But yeah, so basically, like, let's go to my age cohort. So it looks like mine from 30 to 39 is 8.23% of the ICU visits. It's not insignificant, but if you go back to the chances of actually dying, it's 0.03 or 0.03%. So just very low. So we go to ICU capacity. So this, to me, was quite shocking. The baseline ICU capacity in Alberta is 173 people. Since January 1st, 2021, this capacity has ranged from 270 to 168. This capacity is for all of Alberta. Currently, COVID ICU usage is 198 people. Non-COVID ICU is 44. Unoccupied ICU beds is 39. So basically, they're saying that the whole ICU is filling up and we're going to overwhelm our hospital system. But to me, this seems like a laughable joke that it's like, we've got like 270 ICU beds, and it's like, can't you get more? Like, instead of locking down the whole country, locking down the whole province, and basically mandating forced vaccinations, it's like, well, why don't you figure out how to get this up to 400 or 500 ICU beds and actually do your job and solve some problems? So if you actually take the Alberta population, which is 4.371 million people, and you do 270 ICU beds, which is the top amount of ICU beds we've had, and you divide it by the population of Alberta, as a percentage, it's 0.0000617%. To me, that seems ridiculously small. So here's our chart of ICU usage. This bottom line represents how much of it's actually COVID related. This this line, this area is relating to how much is non-COVID, and then this top kind of area is excess capacity. So this is what they're talking about when they're freaking out about no capacity, is that we're reaching this kind of upper limit. But it's like that upper limit's like 270 beds, which seems quite small. Okay, then we go over to comorbidities for death in ICU. So basically, we have the deaths here. So 76% of the deaths had 3 comorbidities or more. 13.5% had 2 conditions as well. 7% had 1, and 3.4% had no condition. And ICU, it was much more broad. That is kind of broken up 22%, 22%, 22%, and 33%. So basically all the people that died had 2 to 3 plus conditions, comorbidities, which would represent 89.5% of the deaths. So if we look at some over the comorbidities, hypertension, so high blood pressure, cardiovascular diseases, renal diseases, diabetes, dementia, respiratory diseases, cancer, stroke, liver diseases, immunodeficient diseases. So it's basically old and sick people who are dying from COVID. Like the average age is, I believe, is 79 years old for the death of COVID. So to me, it's unfortunate that old and sick people are dying because of this, but not necessarily unexpected. Okay, then we move over to number of days between the vaccine and COVID diagnosis. So basically, these are charts from the Alberta government website. Number of days between first immunization date and COVID diagnosis. So this is basically on the zero part. It's like we're going to give you your first dose of COVID. And then afterwards, it's based on age. And it doesn't look like I copied the age part here. But kind of the dark colors are the older people, and these like yellow and orange colors are the younger people. And so what we see is a massive spike in the diagnosis of cases, of COVID cases, basically falling directly after they receive the vaccine. To me, this looks like it's like the vaccine gives you COVID. Um, and based on how they report is that for the first 14 days after you receive the vaccine, you're not considered protected from the vaccine. And so it's actually, these cases are reported as unvaccinated people who are getting COVID-19, which seems like a whole lot of BS to me. And so you see a similar spike in hospitalizations as well as COVID deaths following the first dose administration. So we're going to go through all these charts in a bigger kind of graph. So we've made it bigger. So basically here's the 14 days. And so these people are all considered unvaccinated and we reported in those numbers. So seems quite significant. And then we move over to second dose, so number of days between second immunization date and COVID-19 diagnosis. So again, they have the 14 kind of day period where it says that the virus, you don't actually get protection. So these kind of cases would go back onto the partially vaccinated cases. But what's kind of shocking here is we see like this tremendous spike at about 60, 80, 100 days. Where it's basically after you've gotten the vaccine. And what would that be? 2 to 3 months later, now you're seeing an uptick in cases. And so it's like basically people who have got the vaccine 2 to 3 to 4 months ago now could be showing up in the COVID numbers as being diagnosed with it. And it's like, that's a little concerning. And then we move over to total hospitalizations. So again, same thing, these 14-day right here are all going to be put into the unvaccinated category, even though they've actually received the vaccine. And it's like, to me, this actually should be its own category, and it would be indicative of actually getting COVID from the vaccine itself. So we see it drops off quite significantly afterwards. Second dose, same kind of thing. It's not nearly as big a spike in the beginning, but it does come up later. And the most shocking to me is total deaths. Number of days between first immunization date and COVID diagnosis. So basically, these are people who received the COVID vaccine, died, and it was classified as a COVID death. Not as a vaccine death, as a COVID death. Again, so these 14, it's basically like you're considered unvaccinated. This seems like murder to me. Like, I don't know how else to put that, but basically total deaths, number of days between first immunization and COVID-19 diagnosis. And again, the same thing, very just kind of one death here, one death there. Guess it's not a big deal. Okay, current cases of COVID. So these are basically new cases, active cases, and currently hospitalized. So of the new cases, they've been completely vaccinated, so they've received both doses of the vaccine, and it's been 14 days since the second dose. They represent about 23% of the population of new people who are getting COVID, diagnosed with COVID. People who are partially vaccinated, so this is basically 14 days after the first vaccine, or it could be actually after the second vaccine within the first 14 days. They represent 6.33%. And then we have unvaccinated, which is 70.77%, but this includes basically people in this category right here. So if we go for like the first 14 days after vaccination, they would be placed into the category of unvaccinated. So again, it's like until they actually break it up into their own categories, you can't actually see what the rate of unvaccinated people getting infected versus people who have just received the vaccine but don't quote unquote have its protection yet. So they're considered unvaccinated. So we move over to active cases. Similar kind of numbers, completely vaccinated. This is 23.33%. Again, this does not seem to line up with what I hear on the media. The media says it's like 90% of people who are unvaccinated are the ones who are getting sick. that's not what their own data says. 23% have been completely vaccinated, both doses, and yet are an active case. Partially vaccinated, 7.2%. This also includes people who have their second dose within the first 14 days. And then we go to 69% who are considered unvaccinated, but again, this includes people who receive the vaccine in the first 14 days. Currently hospitalized, so we have 22.01% have received complete vaccination, and yet they're in the hospital for COVID. 3.65%, which is 32 patients, have received partial vaccination, so basically 14 days after the first vaccine to 14 days of receiving the second vaccine, and then unvaccinated are 74%. But again, this includes people who had received the vaccine within the first 14 days, and if we go to hospitalizations, that would include this big lump right here of people who actually received the vaccine but are considered unvaccinated. Okay, so then we go to total adverse side effects in Canada. I couldn't find any Alberta data, so I decided to just go to Canada to get kind of like a more broad perspective and actually show that there is documented side effects from these vaccines. So basically the upper purple one is serious kind of side effects, and then the blue one is non-serious, and this is cumulative. So basically as more people get the vaccine, there's more kind of reported side effects. The Alberta government hasn't published their numbers, but back in the spring of 2021, they did announce that at least 3 people have died of the vaccine so far. So there is a total of 14,702 reports of adverse side effects from the COVID vaccine as of September 3rd, 2021. To me, this seems dramatically underreported because probably about 60% of the people I've heard have got the vaccine had at least some kind of side effects, but I don't know one of them that actually reported these side effects to the government. 3,967 of these reports were considered serious. These side effects seem to disproportionately affect women. So if we go over here, basically it's like this orange one here is males, and then this blue one here is females. So if you go through it, it's very dramatically scaled to women who have like the rough side effects from these vaccines. So if we go on a percentage basis, from 18 to 29, it's 68% of females who are having the side effects. From 30 to 39, again, my age bracket, it's 80% female. 40 to 49, 80%, 81%. 50 to 59, 76%. 70% from 60 to 69. I don't know, this does not look good. Here's kind of like a list of the most frequent side effects. So basically tingling in the area, vaccination site pain, headache, itching, labored breathing, fatigue, nausea, redness in the area, hives, dizziness, fever over 38 degrees, vaccination site swelling, etc., chest pain, blah, blah, blah. These are kind of like the most common symptoms. Here we have some of the serious side effects. Myocarditis, so basically inflammation of the heart muscle lining, 676 cases. Bell's palsy or facial paralysis, 454 cases. Pulmonary embolism, 281 cases, and 188 cases where the outcome was death. They say that it's not actually related to the COVID vaccine, but I beg to differ. Okay, so now we go to actual annual deaths in Canada, or in Alberta. So if we look at this, 2014 we had 24,000 deaths, total 2016, basically 24,600 roughly. 2017, 25,600. 2018, 26,000. 2019, 26,300. And 2020, 29,310 deaths. So I charted it out back to 1990. Again, this is data pulled from the Alberta government. And basically, to me, it looks like we have this trend line. And I'd probably say it's about 2,000 to 3,000 deaths above trend line, which is about what the COVID deaths were. So it's like, to me, this is certainly unfortunate, but it's not crazy. It's not really out of the proportion, especially with these year kind of like being very close. It it just doesn't seem that dramatic to me. So we go through leading causes of death. So we had total COVID deaths of 2,495 in Alberta since March 2020 to September 15th, 2021. Annually in 2019 in Alberta, 1,997 people died in Alberta of organic dementia. So Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, Huntington's disease, multiple sclerosis, rough diseases, not that fun. Annually in 2019, 1,886 people in Alberta died of all forms of chronic ischemic heart disease. To me, I didn't really fully understand, but like I consider that like heart attacks, like you mean heart problems. And then we go over again 2019, 1,886 people. I might have got that number wrong. Might be around like 1,500 actually, I think, because it looks like I just pulled the same number for that. People died in Alberta of malignant neoplasms of the trachea, bronchitis, lung, and the lung. So basically like lung cancer. So I believe this was around 1,500. So if you looked at this on an annualized basis, we'd probably be looking at like the fourth or fifth leading cause of death in Alberta would be COVID. Not ideal, but also not a reason to shut down the whole economy and do forced vaccinations on every person, regardless of their freedoms. So conclusions, 91.66% of COVID deaths have been from people aged 60 to 80 plus years old. People 59 years or younger have a 99+% chance of survival if infected with COVID. People 80 years old have basically a 19.83 chance of death if infected. So about a 1 in 5 chance of death if you're 80 plus. 80 to 90% of these deaths occurred between November 1st, 2021 and March 1st of 20. I believe these actually should be backwards. So this should be 2020, and then this should be 2021. And that's basically going back to this chart. That basically like the big spike, like the vast majority of deaths came in this time period between November to March of the previous winter. Okay. Baseline ICU capacity for the province is 173 and is bumped up to a max of 270 beds for COVID, beds during COVID. The percentage of ICU beds to the population is 0.000006177%. 89.5% of COVID deaths had 2+ comorbidities. There appears to be a tremendous spike in COVID cases, hospitalizations, and deaths attributed to COVID after the administration of the first dose of your vaccine. These appear to be labeled as unvaccinated cases, hospitalizations, or COVID deaths if they happen within 14 days. It appears that most COVID deaths in the past 6 months could be attributed to people who have actually received the vaccine. So if we go back to our chart here, so it looks like we have kind of approximately 5 to about a max of around 10 people dying per day. And then we go over to our actual deaths here. And it's like, okay, well, looks like we have 5 to 10 people dying. And this isn't one for one, because this is kind of like based on from the date that they got the vaccine and they added it to it. But it's like, okay, so we have people dying from basically receiving the first dose of the vaccine. And then we also have 1-2 people kind of on a pretty consistent basis dying after they've received the second vaccine. Again, this is, and they're basically saying that this has nothing to do with the immunization. This is just like, oh, we gave you the vaccine, but then somehow you just died of COVID. Just, you mean 3-4 months afterwards, but it wasn't the vaccine, it was COVID. And it's like, yeah, I'm not so sure about that. Roughly 23% of new and active cases and hospitalizations are people who are fully vaccinated. Roughly 7% of new and active cases are people who have received 1 dose of the vaccine, and this is basically considered after 14 days of having received the vaccine. Roughly 70% of new inactive cases are people who are considered unvaccinated, but this includes people who received their first dose of the vaccine within 14 days. So again, this is basically this big spike right here. People who have received the vaccine are considered unvaccinated. It appears that, wrong chart, there have been at least 14,702 reports of adverse side effects of from COVID vaccines across Canada. Again, this number seems extremely low to me. Just virtually nobody reports it. And then I also came out, I believe, in Ontario that it's like if you were a nurse or a doctor and you're speaking out about COVID, you're basically going to have your whole license thrown out that you can no longer be a doctor or no longer be a nurse. So there seems to be a whole bunch of censorship on this issue too. These side effects seem to affect women at a much higher degree. Between about 60 to 70 to 80% of the side effects from these vaccines seem to affect women, depending on the age bracket. And death is one potential side effect of the vaccine, which again seems perplexing when for people who are under the age of, let's say, 50, basically have under a 0% chance, or under a 1% chance of dying from the vaccine. And it's like, I'd much rather take my chances with actually getting sick and letting my body deal with it, rather than having unknown substances put into my body. Annual death rate in Alberta in the 2020 was about 2,000 to 3,000 higher than the trend line. This is about 10% higher than normal. Not great, but also not overly expected. On an annual basis, it would probably be about the fourth or fifth leading cause, COVID as death. So this is kind of my initial presentation. I'm looking to, basically, if you have any feedback, any things that, information I'm missing, any things that I made mistakes on, I'd really appreciate that kind of feedback. And my plan is to file a charter notice against the Alberta government, basically highlighting that they violated a number of my charter rights, and I'm actually looking to get this whole kind of like COVID lockdown actually put back and get rid of it. But thanks for watching.